Okay, this is lecture 14, continuing to discuss Mill's account of utilitarianism. So you'll remember that last time I talked extensively about Mill's theory of the higher pleasures, and I ended by arguing that you shouldn't think of Mill's higher pleasures argument as intended to be an actuarial argument, that is, an argument about how you count overall welfare for the purposes of applying the greatest happiness principle. You should think of it rather as a theory of life. That is a conception that Mill hopes individuals will adopt themselves in their own life as an account of what they ought to strive for. So it's not relevant to calculation. It's relevant primarily to people's beliefs about how they should be conducting themselves and what they should be aiming for. And as I was arguing in the last lecture, Mill's general position is that we should cultivate the pursuit of the higher pleasures, including the moral virtues, including forms of love and friendship, including aesthetic pursuits, philanthropic pursuits, and so on, for their own sake. So we talked about all of that in the last lecture. I want to just also mention that you shouldn't infer from this, however, that Mill's understanding of ethics and morality is concerned only with the cultivation of personal virtue or ideals of character. It certainly does include that. And one of the striking things about Mill's argument and his position is that he thinks that a traditional virtue ethics is in fact completely consistent with classical utilitarian position, a view which is quite controversial even to this day, but he takes it seriously. But that for Mill is only a part of the ethical and moral view that he thinks the utility principle supports. Because there's another aspect of ethics and morality which doesn't have to do with virtues and the cultivation of character ideals and perfectionism and human flourishing, valuing things for their own sake. There's also an aspect of ethics and morality which Mill takes very seriously, which has to do with respecting rights and following rules. And being guided by general principles that prohibit certain kinds of actions and permit others. And I want to emphasize that despite the stress on virtue that you get in utilitarianism, Mill does not intend any of this to displace a more traditional modern view in which the most important aspect of ethics and morality, at least for political purposes and legal purposes, is a matter of upholding and following certain principles and rules of action. And very much like Bentham, and in fact, if anything, more explicitly than Bentham, Mill is concerned to say that you shouldn't expect in general individuals to follow the utility principle directly in their own choices. Rather, Mill says it's going to be more efficient and effective in general if agents act on what he calls secondary principles to guide their action. And he gives a very interesting and I think telling analogy in this context that I just want to talk about. It's an analogy with navigation. This is on pages 113 to 114 of your Troyer reader. Mill says, "It is a strange notion that the acknowledgement of a first principle," and here he's of course thinking of the utility principle, "is inconsistent with the admission of secondary ones. To inform a traveler respecting the place of his ultimate destination is not to forbid the use of landmarks and direction posts on the way. The proposition that happiness is the end and aim of morality does not mean that no road ought to be laid down to that goal, or that persons going thither should not be advised to take one direction rather than another. And then he goes on to say, nobody argues that the art of navigation isn't founded on astronomy because sailors cannot wait to calculate the nautical almanac. So, what he's saying here basically is the proposal that individual agents try to apply the utility principle directly to their own actions is a little bit like asking sailors sailing off to sea to calculate from scratch the whole of the astronomical tables from which more general rules of navigation are derived. And Mill is pointing out, well, nobody thinks that that's how sailors should behave, and it's exactly the same with the utility principle. Being rational creatures, he continues, they go to sea with the nautical almanac ready calculated. It's already set out in certain general rules of navigation. And all rational creatures, here he fleshes out the analogy, go out upon the sea of life with their minds made up on the common questions of right and wrong, as well as on many of the far more difficult questions of wise and foolish. And this, as long as foresight is a human quality, is to be presumed that they will continue to do. Whatever we adopt as the fundamental principle of morality, and of course Mill thinks the principle of utility is the fundamental such principle, we require subordinate principles to apply it by. The impossibility of doing without them being common to all systems, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read the rest of this. But you get the general idea, right? So Mill is here incorporating the Bentham-Hume analysis, right? So Bentham and Hume both think that in the course of human development, human societies have the capacity to recognize certain kinds of act types, like the act type rape, or the act type fraud, or the act type murder, that we learn over the painful trial and error of human experience. We learn that those act types are generally disutile. They hurt people. And the general rule, the precept, avoid murder, try not to defraud and swindle people, don't engage in rape, they are, in Mill's account, like particular signposts that point us in the right direction day to day, right? And that's his general account of how ethics and morality work. And much like Bentham and Hume, Mill places a good deal of faith in what he calls here common sense, which he thinks is derived from the trial and error of human experience. So don't make the mistake of thinking, as many textbooks say, that Mill is a naive utilitarian any more than Bentham is, who argues that we should try directly to follow the rule, maximize general utility at all times, at all waking moments of our life. In this respect, Mill is at one with Bentham and Hume in recognizing the general utility of following rules. And I'll come back to this later on in today's lecture when I talk a little bit about Mill's view about rights and justice, because it applies this general intuition in a way that I think you'll find interesting and worth reflecting on. Let me abstract for a moment from Mill. I will come back to him, and just mention at this point, I mean, by now you should have a pretty good general handle on how the classical utilitarian framework is constructed. And I want to note, I mean, as I've mentioned already, and I'll come back to this later in this lecture, utilitarianism, of course, invites certain fairly obvious and to many powerful objections. And I'll come to some of those in a moment. But before you just indulge your intuitive disgust towards the utilitarian idea, I think it's important also to face up to some of the clear intuitive advantages and merits of the utilitarian approach. And I think if you take these seriously, you will understand why classical utilitarianism was so persuasive to so many in the modern period, and why it still tempts many figures. One thing to keep in mind is that the appeal to pleasure and pain at least looks, in fact, I think on reflection it's a bit more complicated than the utilitarians thought, but there is something right about the thought that pleasure and pain afford something like a culturally neutral or impartial ethical or political standard that allows us to step back from the dogmas and conventional wisdom and orthodoxies into which we get socialized, and to consider them from a more critical and impartial standpoint, right? As the utilitarians never tire of saying, just assuming the prevailing religious beliefs or the prevailing traditions or the prevailing cultural norms, just presuming that they are correct, right, doesn't seem to allow you to gain any critical distance. Indeed, it seems like a recipe for unreflective conformity to the existing way of doing things. And the utilitarians take very seriously the idea that it's important to introduce some degree of critical distance and not just swallow whole and without critical reflection the various practices and folkways and cultural predispositions that we inherit through the process of socialization. And I think there is something powerful about the claim that hedonic pleasure and pain look like good first principles for thinking about how we might repair to a critically impartial standpoint. Because in the end of the day, for all of the differences between different societies and cultures, human beings remain basically psychologically the same. And pleasure and pain don't really vary from culture to culture. And it's on that basis that the utilitarians thought, to some extent plausibly, that an appeal to, well, does this in the end of the day promote human pleasure and mitigate human misery? That looks like a standard that virtually any human society could sign on to as a powerful basis for subjecting their institutions and practices to critical scrutiny. Note, too, while I'm talking about this, that this hedonic standard, this hedonistic criterion, that the claim that pleasure and pain are ultimately what matters, also inclines utilitarianism towards something which has, of course, become increasingly important in the modern world, which is the question of how we ought to humanely and morally treat animals. And in this respect, too, perhaps the natural law tradition, which tends to confine the sphere of concern to rational beings, is a little bit less inclusive than utilitarianism. Bentham, in particular, is one of the early advocates of animal welfare, because what matters for a utilitarian in terms of moral and ethical concern is sentience, the capacity to suffer and the capacity to experience joy. And since many animals fairly clearly have that capacity, Mill, Bentham, and the utilitarian tradition all agree that if we're thinking about general welfare, we can't just confine our concerns to the human community, because although human communities are distinctively rational, it's only to our knowledge human beings who have evolved the higher capacities of rational reflection and so forth. Human beings are not the only beings on earth that are capable of experiencing pain and pleasure. Many, many animals fall into that category too. And so it shouldn't surprise us, and I think on reflection this is an attractive feature of the utilitarian view, it shouldn't surprise us that some of the most vociferous advocates of animal rights and animal welfare have come out of the utilitarian tradition. This is particularly true, for example, of the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, who is one of the most prominent contemporary utilitarians, and actually a friend of mine. He wrote a very, very famous and influential book on animal rights that has in fact convinced very many of its readers to become vegetarians. And it shouldn't surprise us that that concern for animal welfare comes out of the utilitarian tradition. And you might think that that's a merit of the utilitarian view for all of its perhaps other failings. Another virtue of the utilitarian proposal, which was certainly something that Mill and Bentham took seriously, is that insofar as we accept that pleasure and pain are in principle measurable quantities, right? Now, no doubt there are difficulties in measuring it, but in principle, it seems like we can, in fact, make judgments. We can look at different kinds of diseases. We can look at different kinds of experiences, and we can make maybe rough and ready, but still meaningful and in some cases scientific judgments about how happy certain kinds of experiences make people and how miserable certain kinds of experiences make people. And this permits political theory and ethical criticism not to be thought of as something that is separate from science and social science, more particularly, but as connected to each other, and to bring what human scientists and ethicists are doing into propitious mutual alignment. You'll remember from Bentham's Principles of Morals and Legislation, when he describes what he calls his felicific calculus, he notices that pleasures and pains can be measured along several different dimensions, the most important of which are intensity, right, how powerful or weak pleasures and pains might be, duration, how long they last, right? I mean, we can again measure how bad a certain episode of pain is by asking how many hours it went on for, or how many days it went on for. And surely we all, when we make judgments, well, was my kidney stone worse than, delivering a baby, right? I mean, we can make a rough and ready judgment. Well, the kidney stone was much worse because even though the pain was pretty much as intense as delivering my first child, the kidney stone lasted for weeks, whereas my labor, when I delivered my first child, that only lasted for maybe 6 or 7 hours, right? So again, there's something I think attractive about the idea that you can make relatively precise measurements of just how bad a certain set of experiences are in terms of their duration. The other two dimensions that Bentham recognizes, which are still quite important in action theory and decision theory and in economics today, and there's a lot of really highly technical discussion of this, have to do with probabilities, right? How likely it is. I mean, think of prospect theory in economics and rational expectations and so forth, all about how we measure probabilities. This is, of course, a very, very important and significant consideration these days when we make judgments about, lockdowns, or whether we follow the Great Barrington Declaration, which came out last week, suggesting a very, very different approach to how to deal with COVID. These are judgments about the risk or probability that certain kinds of outcomes will occur. And again, that seems in principle capable, if we're good mathematicians and we understand probability theory well, this makes it possible, at least in principle, for us to do ethics and social criticism in a mathematically and scientifically respectable and rigorous way. The fourth and final dimension that Bentham mentions is what he calls propinquity. What he's talking about there is this complicated question, which you will again have encountered perhaps in economics, about how much we should discount the future, right? I mean, a dollar today is worth a dollar today, but if I'm given the choice between accepting a dollar right now and accepting that same dollar in 10 years' time, right, we would probably regard accepting the dollar in 10 years' time as worth less to us because we discount future benefits intuitively. And again, there's room for analysis of what a sensible view about discounting the future would look like. And there's been a lot of work done on this in decision theory and in economics. And to the extent that Bentham and Mill persuade us that ethical analysis could learn something from those kinds of discussions, then we've united social science with ethical judgment. Of course, you might be skeptical that these kinds of calculations can be extraordinarily precise in the way that maybe a physicist might require measurements of planetary trajectories or the movements of comets or the behavior of atoms to be under different circumstances. It might be that we can't be quite that precise, but we might be able to be precise enough to produce non-trivial, surprising judgments about what the rational policy for us to pursue might be. And that, again, I think is a second virtue of the utilitarian approach. A third merit is that the utilitarians, I think, have a very healthy suspicion of abstraction in political reflection. In general, they're suspicious of kind of uncritical claims about natural rights, about conformity to tradition and widely accepted religious dogmas. They're even sometimes suspicious of claims about the value of certain virtues that are thought to be valuable for their own sake. And they're able to combat that tendency to abstract these rather general categories. They're able to do that because they're able to say that in the end of the day, none of these things really matter in and of themselves. What ultimately matters is something flesh and blood. What matters is how they contribute to quality of life. And if we've internalized an idea of what it is to be virtuous for its own sake, that will only lead us to be miserable, then utilitarians, I think, ask the perfectly reasonable question, well, what interest do we really have in such a virtue? If it's actually making us miserable or carries massive opportunity costs in closing off certain forms of pleasure and happiness, then we should seriously ask the question, well, are these virtues really virtues? Are they really valuable? Ditto for rights. Of course, that doesn't mean that when we subject things like rights or ethical rules to utilitarian analysis, that it won't turn out that we'll conclude that actually the recognition and protection of these rights or the upholding of these rules or the preservation of certain traditions may be indeed valuable because they promote the general welfare. And if that's the case, fine, then we should keep them. But it's a little bit like number one, right? What's I think helpful about the utilitarian approach is that it gives us an independent standard whereby to make that judgment. We ask, do these practices, does conformity to these various expectations, conceptions of virtue, do they or do they not actually contribute materially to the quality of life of flesh and blood human beings? If they do, great, let's keep them. If they don't, then maybe we should try to socialize people not to take these ideas as seriously as they do, because all they're doing, if that's the case, is closing off valuable forms of human pleasure and happiness that we have a legitimate interest in securing. Fourth, and this is related to some of the others, but perhaps merits mentioning separately, of course, the utilitarian approach fits with an absolutely commonsensical intuition that the rational thing for us to do when we think about how to behave and how to evaluate social institutions is to actually look at the costs and benefits of the alternatives before us. And we do this all the time, right? When we get multiple offers to go to this or that law school or to pursue this or that career, right? We sit down and we try as best we can to weigh up the costs and benefits, right? So this law school has these kind of advantages. It has a really good program that's connected to my interests, but maybe it's not quite as prestigious as this other one, even though this other one doesn't have quite a strong faculty in the areas that I'm particularly interested in. And we try to weigh these advantages and disadvantages up. We weigh, as we say, the pros and cons. And we do that all the time. It's an absolutely basic feature of human ethical and prudential deliberation. And one way to understand what the utilitarians are doing, and one reason for its intuitive force, is that the classical utilitarians can be thought of as simply generalizing that perfectly commonsensical idea. And fifth, this one I'm a bit more hesitant about, but although, of course, it's controversial for some reasons I'll get into in a moment, whether utilitarianism really successfully does this, it at least looks as if it's got a reasonable approach to how to balance rational self-concern, that is, concern for what will benefit each of us individually, with a concern for the effects of our actions on others, right? So it looks as if it provides a helpful framework for balancing egoistic concerns, self-concern, individual prudence, with a more general requirement that we promote benevolence, collective prudence on behalf of the whole. So it looks as if the utilitarians have at least the beginnings of a propitious framework for balancing self-concern and altruism. Again, that's a bit more controversial because, as I'm sure many of you will have started to worry, it's not completely clear that the utilitarians have a watertight way of doing this, but they've at least got an approach, and the approach in many cases doesn't seem to be completely crazy. Still, for all of these virtues, utilitarianism has invited and will surely continue to invite a number of quite serious objections. And I want to mention two of the most serious. One is a worry about indeterminacy, right? So the utilitarians talk all the time about happiness, and they talk about pleasure and pain, but one might legitimately worry that the way they understand happiness, when you actually look at the fine print, it turns out to be so capacious and so plastic a category that in the end of the day, their arguments, although they appear to be appealing to some uncontroversial idea of human happiness, that actually they're appealing to something that is rather empty and indeterminate. To illustrate this problem, just remember again Mill's arguments about the higher pleasures. As I hope I convinced you in the last lecture, there's a lot, I think, to be said in favor of Mill's general account. So it looks on paper like a fairly strong argument. But the question is whether there's anything really distinctively utilitarian about what he says about the value of aspirational ideals, like valuing aesthetic practice for its own sake, or seeking to satisfy human curiosity about our place in the universe, if we're a scientist, for example. The worry here is that while what Mill says makes good sense, it's not so clear that what he's alluding to in these arguments is really distinctively utilitarian. Well, the worry is that he's actually just smuggling in a bunch of intuitions that are not distinctively utilitarian and then arrogating them to a utilitarian view. That's the sort of worry I have in mind. So, Mill may well be right that our lives go better if we pursue his higher pleasures, invest ourselves wholeheartedly in projects, cultivate successful friendships and love with others, engage with aesthetic experiences, pursue beauty and appreciate beauty and so forth. But why not just say that these are all aspects of what it is for a human being to flourish, and say that that's all that we're really talking about? In what sense do we have to say that these are hedonic qualities, that these are really reducible simply to pleasure and pain in any sense, as any genuine utilitarian position would have to say? The worry, again, then, is that aggregate happiness, as utilitarians use it, turns out to be, or may turn out to look, more like an empty vessel than the kind of sharp-edged critical standard that they claim that it is. It's an empty vessel into which they pour whatever non-utilitarian content strikes them as independently plausible. And if we were convinced of this worry, then we might conclude that actually the classical utilitarians are barking up the wrong tree, that most of the work is being done in their arguments not by anything that is distinctively utilitarian, but rather by appealing to a bunch of other non-utilitarian intuitions about what it means for a human being to flourish and live well. And they're simply smuggling all that stuff in and putting the kind of rosette of utilitarianism on it, but they're not really entitled to do that. What they should really be saying is that with common sense, there are certain ways to flourish and certain ways to not flourish, And we don't really need the critical, we don't really need the general happiness principle to figure that out. We just need to appeal to a variety of non-utilitarian intuitions about what makes a human life go well and what makes a human life go badly. And that's a serious worry, that in the end of the day, the general happiness principle is too indeterminate. It will ratify too many things, and it doesn't really have the critical implications that Mill and Bentham and others claim for it. That's a serious worry. It's one that you should think about. I'm not going to say anything further about it, but as you reflect, especially on Mill's higher pleasures argument, you should certainly keep it in mind. But I do want to focus a little bit, because it provides an excuse for us to look at Mill's arguments in Chapter 5 of Utilitarianism about justice. I do want to focus on another famous objection to utilitarianism. I've mentioned this already in an earlier lecture. It's the objection that Rawls and others, Robert Nozick makes a similar objection, made in the late 20th century. And this general objection travels often under the label of the separateness of persons objection. And the basic worry here is that utilitarianism subjects individual lives to, as Rawls puts it, the calculus of social interests. And one way to think about this kind of objection is to say that utilitarianism assumes a false analogy between individual prudence and collective prudence, between individual egoism and social welfare or general welfare, right? We all agree, the objector might say, that it's okay for me to sacrifice myself now in order to bring about some future benefit, right? If I choose to go and have root canal now, I do it, I endure the suffering of dental treatment for the next hour and a half in the dentist's chair in order to protect myself against the future pain of toothache. So it's no one disagrees that there's anything wrong with doing that, right? But as I emphasized in my earlier lecture on Bentham, utilitarians often tend to say that we should think the same way about collective welfare. Just as I individually can sacrifice myself now for the sake of some greater reward down the road, so we can sacrifice the few in order to produce a greater benefit for a larger number of people. And that's often the way that utilitarian logic works, but Rawls and others who've made the separateness of persons objection charge that analogy doesn't work. Why? It doesn't work because the collective case is not unified in the same way. We're talking here about separate individuals with their own individual lives. And we can't just sacrifice the few for the sake of the many in exactly the same way that it makes sense for an individual to voluntarily sacrifice or forego a benefit now in order to secure a greater benefit to themselves in the future. And this leads a lot of critics like Rawls to say, well, the problem with utilitarianism is that it doesn't absolutely prohibit, as we should, the sacrifice of the few to the many. Rather, what utilitarians do is to describe conditions under which it would be permissible for us to sacrifice the few to the many. And the problem about doing that is that utilitarianism thereby reveals itself to be an essentially manipulative view. Utilitarians are willing to treat individuals and their lives merely as means, simply as exploitable resources that can sometimes be sacrificed for the sake of a greater aggregate good for many more other people. And that's one of the really powerful objections to utilitarianism. Rawls himself, you might be interested to know, says that in order to remedy that defect in utilitarianism, we have to abandon utilitarianism entirely and go back to a revived version of social contract theory, because the great virtue of social contract theory in this context, Rawls thinks anyway, is that it enables us to model social choice in a way that gives each and every individual a veto over those policies that they might fear would excessively treat them and their lives simply as exploitable resources to be used to benefit people other than themselves. And this, of course, goes way beyond the scope of this course, but I did just want to mention that that's the way that some of Hobbes and Locke's ideas about the social contract return with a vengeance in the late 20th century as a corrective, as Rawls and others see it, to a form of utilitarianism that they see as not taking the separateness of persons and their lives seriously enough. As I've said, so I want to say so that's a powerful objection, but I think that one of the great virtues of Mill's final concluding discussion in utilitarianism in chapter 5 of justice is that it offers a few clues about how utilitarians might respond to this seemingly very powerful separateness of persons objection. And I want to conclude today's lecture just by reviewing Mill's relevant aspects, anyway, of Mill's discussion of justice in chapter 5 of utilitarianism, and then try to show why they give Mill and perhaps classical utilitarians more generally at least the beginnings of a robust response to the separateness of persons objection. I'm not going to argue here that this line of argument completely clears utilitarianism of the charge, but I think you'll start to see, I hope, that Mill and co. at least have some resources by which to respond to this. Note first, and here I'm just summarizing some of the things that you'll remember from chapter 5 of utilitarianism. Notice first that in line with the standard utilitarian approach, Mill does not treat the value of justice as basic or freestanding. He can't, because he's a utilitarian and he thinks that everything is in the end answerable to the real basic claim, which is the greatest happiness principle. And when he's thinking about justice, he's thinking about a complex cluster of intuitions and norms that are woven into day-to-day social practices. And he says, he identifies a number of strands in this cluster. The cluster comprises at least a number of ideas about equality, impartiality, fairness, and reciprocity in our mutual dealings. It is connected to various feelings, moral feelings and emotions of resentment and indignation, right? When somebody wrongs us from the standpoint of justice, we feel legitimate resentment. We are indignant at what someone has done. And very often, this is connected with a desire for retribution in the face of such wrongdoing. And this, of course, connects to our standard ordinary understanding of justice as being a matter of giving people their due, what is coming to them, especially if they've violated people's expectations or rights, if they've committed some wrong. We celebrate the fact that we punish them because that's what they deserve, right? That's what's coming to them, right? Poetic justice, right? He also says, look, a commitment to the priority and importance of certain individual rights, especially rights against assault, aggression, predation, fraud, theft. This is a settled component of our ordinary understanding of what justice is about. So when he's thinking of justice, he's thinking of a complex cluster of ideas and intuitions that comprise at least the ones that are there on the slide. And again, typical for a utilitarian, Mill doesn't regard any of this as a kind of shimmering moral truth that is kind of given to us as a natural lawyer might say, by our natural reason, somehow having a kind of transcendental standing that apply cross-culturally. Rather, like other utilitarians, he just thinks of all of this as a mass of feelings and accepted norms that are actually baked into ordinary day-to-day human practice, right? Resentment and indignation, right? These are not things that are just part of some ideal set of moral rules that are accessible to us by our natural reason when it's mobilized in a highly sort of philosophically sophisticated way. These are things that actuate us in a very vivid, direct way in ordinary life. Right? If somebody cuts me off on the road, or if somebody steals my property and I see them running away with my iPhone that I've left, on the Starbucks counter or something, I'm pissed off, right? I mean, I'll get angry, right? And this is for Mill a fact of life, right? So when he thinks about justice, he's thinking of various kinds of reactions and responses that we have to incidents and events in our lives that we recognize as a fairly ordinary feature of human mutual response and reaction. And again, of course, for a utilitarian, the question is going to be, are these feelings and norms and practices, are they worth keeping or modifying? And for a utilitarian, that depends ultimately on whether preserving these practices will tend in the long run to promote overall utility. So in that sense, justice, as the utilitarians understand it, is subordinate to utilitarian calculation. So for a utilitarian, a proponent of retributivist punishment, someone who says, look, you've murdered someone, you deserve to die, right? The utilitarian is going to say, well, okay, that's fine, but only if we think that executing murderers is actually going to have some outweighing deterrent value. It will protect others from suffering a similar fate in the future. There are some retributivists, like Kant, for example, who've been very rigorous about retribution. I mean, Kant famously says, look, even if the world is going to end tomorrow and there's still one murderer in prison whom we can execute, we should still execute them because even though there's going to be no net benefit from doing so, that's the right thing to do. And utilitarians, of course, very impatient about that sort of line because they're going to say, why inflict this pointless suffering, right? Why make this person suffer through an execution when it's going to do absolutely no good because the world is going to end tomorrow? And that's the general sort of position that utilitarians take. But Mill is clear that at least some rules of justice are valuable from a utilitarian point of view, and in particular, Mill insists that basic rights to security of person and property and the disposition to respect them as virtually absolute are in fact justified on utilitarian grounds. And in making this argument, interestingly, Mill helps himself to intuitions that will be familiar to you because we've encountered them already in the political theory of Locke and the political theory of Hobbes. But Mill reinterprets these insights as basically utilitarian ones. So let me just say a little bit about each of these. There's a quasi-Lockean argument in Mill, which is not really so much in the foreground in utilitarianism, but which is certainly a feature of his larger position, because Mill was an economist, and as such, he was a proponent of free markets and commercial society. Remember that by the time Mill is writing in the middle of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing, and he, if anything, appreciates even more so than Locke the advantages of respect for private property rights, because very much like Locke, he thinks that respect for private property is crucial for unleashing the productive potential of capitalist commercial development. But he has no patience for Locke's appeal to natural rights and natural rights to private property. He thinks that's an irrelevant distraction. The point is that the core of Locke's insight from Mill's point of view is that he saw that respecting private property brings larger aggregate benefits, because if we respect the rule of law, we respect private property rights, it enables the process of commercial expansion, and that brings large benefits to society as a whole. And in his writings on political economy, Mill is very clear that although the state is always free to consider regulating the market, in general it should refrain, because usually free markets are more efficient than intrusive government interference. And again, this is a utilitarian judgment. So in this sense, there's a kind of Lockean impetus to Mill's defense of rights of private property, but it's only quasi-Lockean because it doesn't rest on a claim about natural rights to private property. And Mill is very clear about this, for example, in the chapters on socialism, a late work. Mill says, look, society is fully entitled to alter or abrogate any particular right of property which it judges to stand in the way of the public good. So it's only quasi-Lockean. But there's also a quasi-Hobbesian argument in Mill, because Mill connects the value of basic rights in person and property with our overriding interest in security, which he describes as an extraordinarily important and impressive kind of utility. And here he's helping himself to one of Hobbes's major intuitions. This is the key passage. All other earthly benefits are needed by one person, not needed by another. And many of them can, if necessary, be cheerfully foregone or replaced by something else. But security no human being can possibly do without. On it we depend for all our immunity from evil and for the whole value of all and every good. Our notion, therefore, skipping forward a bit, of the claim we have on our fellow creatures to join in making safe for us the very groundwork of our existence gathers feelings around it so much more intense than those concerned in any of the more common cases of utility, that the difference in degree becomes a real difference in kind. So claims of security, he says, assume that character of absoluteness, that apparent infinity and incommensurability with all other considerations, which constitute the distinction between the feeling of right and wrong and that of ordinary expediency and inexpediency. The feelings concerned are so powerful, and we count so positively on finding a responsive feeling in others, that ought and should grow into must, and recognized indispensability becomes a moral necessity. So Mill thinks that Hobbes was on the right track in understanding the overriding importance in self-preservation and security. But again, he wants to recruit that point. So, well, Hobbes kind of spoiled the argument because he didn't see its utility. He simply understood it in terms of rights. But once you see that security is just another and very, very crucial form of human happiness, a precondition for human happiness, then utilitarians can help themselves to Hobbes's argument about the value of security without all of this apparatus of natural rights. And I think that this argument about security suggests a potentially potent reply to the separateness of persons objection, because once you incorporate this, you can ask the question, as utilitarians do, well, what would it be like to live in a world in which at any moment agents, whether they be individuals, private organizations, or states, are permitted in general to deprive others of their lives and goods whenever they judge that their doing so would benefit more people? Wouldn't that be a very insecure world in which we would be constantly anxious about losing our lives and property whenever some utilitarian crusader judges that killing us or stealing our junk would, in fact, in their opinion, be to the general welfare, to the general advantage of everybody? But if we actually enacted that general permission, wouldn't that make life prohibitively miserable? Keep in mind here, too, that utilitarian reformers are most interested in large-scale social practices, those that have the most consequential impact on everyone's prospects for welfare. They're not so much interested in one-off kind of trolley problem kinds of cases. You will have encountered some of these trolley problem thought experiments in philosophy classes. And I don't think Mill and Bentham would have been very interested in those, because they're interested not in one-shot cases, they're interested in general practices. And from that standpoint, a practice, this is Mill's basic argument about security, a practice of virtually unconditional respect for basic rights to security of person and property looks like a very good general policy, because it's going to protect us from the misery of constantly worrying that having had children, those children's lives might be cut short by some kooky utilitarian crusader who decides that they need to kill them in order to cure cancer. And that would make life, just intolerable. And it would make life intolerable hedonically, because we would be unhappy all the time that the people and projects into which we've invested our time, energy, and financial resources could be immediately taken away at the drop of a hat whenever some bozo thinks that they know what's going to make us all better off, right? And you should ask yourself, and I'll end here, when you affirm rights defending life and property, you should ask yourself whether something like Mill's security argument isn't really, at least implicitly, your fundamental reason for affirming those rights. And I think that's certainly it's reasonable to think that something other than Mill's security argument is doing the work. But it's certainly not a crazy argument, and it's certainly worth thinking about. And perhaps in your discussion sections you can play around with this. One way to test your intuitions here would be to consider a case like Flight 93 on 9/11. Not exactly like that case. You'll remember there was this fourth plane that was flying around over Ohio and Pennsylvania, and it was clearly going to be used to maybe fly into the Capitol or perhaps to crash into a suburb, killing thousands on the ground, right? And the question is, what do we do if we've got this plane flying around? This is a one-shot emergency situation in which it looks like shooting down the plane is likely to save many more lives than there are passengers on the plane, especially if we think that the plane is going to crash into a suburb and kill hundreds of thousands of people. Now, you might say, and I think Mill would say, look, since this is an emergency one-shot situation, it might make sense in these rare occasions to violate the passenger's right to life, because making an exception in this kind of really, really unusual and catastrophic emergency situation is unlikely to be significantly detrimental to the more general practice of respect for rights of person and property in ordinary life, right? And you should think about that. And in particular, you should think about, does it seem reasonable to say, and I'll leave you with this question hanging, we must absolutely respect the rights of the passengers and not shoot the plane down in that situation, right? I mean, one thing that's puzzling about that line, which certainly some people would defend, is that sort of rights absolutism that says, look, we should never dirty our hands ever, we should never contemplate ever violating anybody's right to life by never shooting the plane down, even when we think that plane is going to be used to kill a much, much larger number of people. That sort of rights absolutism has a very counterintuitive implication, right? Which you should really think about, because I think this is a strength potentially of the utilitarian view. It has the counterintuitive implication that in a case like Flight 93, it's actually impermissible. It's actually wrong to shoot the plane down. But that sounds a little odd, doesn't it? It sounds a little strange to say that it would actually be morally wrong to take a course of action that would actually save a much larger number of lives than we will destroy in shooting down the plane. And if you think that seems like an odd line to take, that it's actually prohibited, right, impermissible to do that sort of thing, then I think you'll conclude that maybe there's more to the utilitarian position than one might first think, and that utilitarians do have a kind of response to the separateness of persons objection. So think about that. I think these are difficult and tough questions, and I suspect you'll have an interesting discussion in your discussions this week about that question. So thanks very much for listening. I will continue with Mill and his views on liberty next week, but thanks for listening. Bye-bye.